The moment you start counting how often you look behind you, fear has already become part of your routine. I did not realize I had been looking over my shoulder every 7 seconds until a little boy outside a neighborhood grocery store asked his father why the lady kept searching for someone who was not there. His father smiled awkwardly and guided him away, but the question stayed with me long after they disappeared into the parking lot. My name is Claire Bennett, and until 2 weeks earlier, my life had been as ordinary as anyone could hope for. I worked at the Maplewood Community Library outside Boston, lived alone in a small apartment above a family bakery, and spent most evenings reading novels with a mug of tea while jazz played softly through an old speaker that occasionally crackled. Nothing about my life suggested danger. Nothing about me should have attracted unwanted attention. Yet somewhere between my morning walks to work and my quiet evenings carrying borrowed books home, I had developed the habit of checking every reflection, every storefront window, every parked car, and every unfamiliar face that lingered 1 second too long. At first, I blamed stress. Long workdays could make anyone imagine things. Then I blamed exhaustion after volunteering at the literacy program twice a week. Eventually, I stopped making excuses because excuses never slowed my heartbeat when footsteps echoed behind me. The strange feeling never arrived all at once. It grew patiently, like rain collecting on a window until the outside world slowly disappeared behind blurred glass. One morning, I noticed the same dark vehicle parked across from my apartment. 2 days later, I saw what looked like the same baseball cap outside the pharmacy near the library. A week after that, anonymous flowers appeared beside the employee entrance without a card or a name. Every individual moment could have been a coincidence. Together, they felt like pieces of a puzzle I was never supposed to notice. I stopped wearing headphones during my walks. I changed the route between the library and my apartment, only to find myself wondering whether changing directions had become predictable too. Even my coworkers noticed I had grown quieter. Emily asked if everything was all right. I smiled and blamed poor sleep because it sounded far more reasonable than admitting I felt watched by someone I could never actually prove existed. That Thursday evening, cold autumn rain drifted across Maple Avenue as I left the library carrying a canvas tote filled with donated books. Streetlights reflected off the wet pavement in long ribbons of gold, and every passing car sent ripples through shallow puddles gathered along the curb. I counted without meaning to. 7 steps. I looked back. Nothing unusual. 7 more. Another glance. A young couple shared an umbrella. A delivery driver unloaded boxes outside a pharmacy. An elderly man walked his golden retriever. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. I told myself to stop. I took another 7 steps anyway. The coffee shop on the corner felt like the safest place to pause before heading home. Warm light spilled across the sidewalk as I stepped inside, wrapping me in the familiar scent of roasted coffee, cinnamon pastries, and quiet conversations. I ordered my usual drink and turned toward an empty table near the window, hoping 20 peaceful minutes would convince my mind to let go of another anxious day. Instead, before I even reached my seat, a calm voice from nearby interrupted every thought in my head. "You have been checking behind you since you crossed Maple Avenue," the stranger said without raising his voice. I froze where I stood. He looked at me with steady blue eyes, as though he had been expecting me to walk through that door all along. Then he asked the one question no stranger should ever have known to ask. "How long has he been following you?" My fingers tightened around the warm paper cup until the cardboard sleeve bent beneath my grip. The stranger remained perfectly calm, watching me with the kind of quiet patience that belonged to someone who already knew the answer before asking the question. I looked around the coffee shop, expecting to find hidden cameras or someone playing an elaborate prank, but nothing seemed unusual. Students sat with laptops beneath the front windows. An elderly couple shared a slice of apple pie near the counter. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers while the espresso machine hissed in the background. The world continued exactly as it had 1 minute earlier. Only mine had changed. "I think you have the wrong person," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. The man tilted his head ever so slightly. "Do I?" His tone was calm, almost conversational, but there was an unusual certainty behind it that made arguing feel pointless. "You checked the reflection in the pharmacy window before crossing Maple Avenue. Then you looked into the mirror on the parked pickup truck. 7 steps later, you checked again." My heartbeat quickened. Those details had happened less than 5 minutes earlier. Who are you? I asked. Instead of answering immediately, he motioned toward the empty chair across from him. Sit down, Claire. I froze again. How do you know my name? A faint smile appeared. Your library identification badge is attached to your bag. Most people would notice it. You have been paying attention to everything except yourself. Embarrassment mixed with relief. At least one mystery had a simple explanation. I slowly lowered myself into the chair, unable to shake the feeling that somehow this conversation had been waiting for me long before I walked through the door. My name is Damien Moretti, he said. He offered nothing more. No occupation. No explanation. Just a name delivered with quiet confidence. You still have not answered my question, I replied. Why would you think someone is following me? Damien rested one hand beside an untouched espresso. Because fear leaves patterns. Most people never notice them. You look behind you every 7 seconds from the library to this coffee shop. I stared at him. I had counted those steps without realizing anyone else could have been counting too. Maybe I am just nervous, I whispered. Maybe, he agreed. Then answer one question honestly. I nodded without speaking. When did you stop wearing headphones during your walks? My breath caught. I had made that decision nearly 2 weeks earlier after noticing the same unfamiliar vehicle outside my apartment several mornings in a row. I had never mentioned it to anyone. How could you possibly know that? He looked toward the rain-covered window before answering. Because people who believe they are alone behave differently from people who think someone is watching. Silence settled between us. I searched his face for any sign that he was exaggerating or trying to impress me, but there was nothing theatrical about him. Every word sounded measured, as though he preferred facts over opinions. Outside, headlights reflected across the wet pavement, while pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas. Damien glanced toward the street for less than a second before returning his attention to me. Do not look, he said quietly. Instinct immediately urged me to turn around. Why? I asked. Because if someone has been watching you, they are waiting for confirmation that you have finally noticed them. My pulse echoed in my ears. You really believe this is happening? Damien held my gaze without hesitation. No, Claire. His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable certainty. I believe someone has been studying your routine for much longer than you realize, and today was the first day you unknowingly noticed the pattern. For several long seconds, I forgot about my coffee growing cold on the table. My attention stayed fixed on Damien, trying to decide whether I was sitting across from the only person who understood what I had been feeling or the only person who somehow knew far too much about me. Neither possibility made me comfortable. Outside, rain continued to slide down the windows in slow silver lines, turning passing headlights into blurred streaks of gold. The entire coffee shop suddenly felt smaller than it had when I first walked in. Suppose you are right, I said quietly. What exactly am I supposed to do? Damien did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched the people outside moving along the sidewalk beneath umbrellas, his expression calm enough to suggest he was observing patterns instead of strangers. Tell me about your week, he finally said. I frowned. My week? He nodded once. Not your feelings. Your routine. The request sounded strange, but something about his certainty made it difficult to refuse. I told him about opening the library every weekday morning before 9. I explained how I usually stopped at the same coffee shop every Thursday after work because the owner always saved the last cinnamon pastry for me. I mentioned volunteering Tuesday evenings at an adult literacy program and buying fresh bread every Saturday morning from the bakery beneath my apartment. Damien never interrupted. He simply listened, occasionally glancing toward the rain-covered windows before returning his attention to me. When I finished speaking, he leaned back slightly in his chair. When was the last time you changed any of those habits? I searched my memory. I honestly do not know. Months, maybe longer. He nodded slowly. Predictable routines make life comfortable. They also make someone very easy to find. A chill traveled down my spine. I suddenly remembered the anonymous flowers outside the employee entrance, the familiar vehicle parked across from my apartment, and the uncomfortable feeling that someone always seemed to appear wherever I happened to be. They had never arrived at random. They had arrived exactly where I was expected to be. So you think someone memorized my schedule? I asked. I think someone invested time learning it. His answer came without hesitation. That is a very different thing. My phone vibrated inside my purse before I could respond. The sound made me jump. Embarrassed, I reached for it and looked at the screen. No caller identification. No message. Just an incoming call from an unknown number. Damien noticed the screen before I answered. Do not pick up. I looked at him in surprise. Why not? Because if the call matters, they will leave a message. If it does not, they only want to know whether you will respond. The phone continued ringing for several more seconds before falling silent. A moment later, another notification appeared. This time it was a text message containing only 3 words. Nice umbrella today. My heart immediately began racing. I had carried a navy umbrella when I left the library less than 30 minutes earlier. I slowly lifted my eyes toward Damien. He did not ask what the message said. Somehow he already knew it mattered. You brought a navy umbrella because the weather forecast predicted rain until 7 o'clock, he said calmly. You probably bought it last fall because the handle shows signs of regular use. I stared at him in disbelief. How do you keep noticing these things? For the first time since we met, a faint smile crossed his face. Because details tell the truth long before people do. He stood, placed several bills beneath his untouched espresso, and reached for his coat. Go home exactly the way you planned tonight, Claire. Do not change a single step. I looked at the message still glowing on my phone. After this, he nodded once. Especially after this. Someone believes they understand your routine. Tonight, I want to find out who is confident enough to prove it. Damien disappeared into the rain without another word, leaving me alone with a cooling cup of coffee and a phone that suddenly felt heavier than it had only minutes before. I looked down at the message again. Nice umbrella today. 3 simple words. No greeting. No signature. No direct threat. Yet somehow they carried enough weight to make the entire coffee shop feel unfamiliar. Whoever had sent them wanted me to know one thing above everything else. They had seen me before I ever noticed them. I slipped the phone into my purse, took one slow breath, and walked outside exactly as Damien had instructed. The rain had softened into a light mist that settled quietly over Maple Avenue. Cars rolled past with headlights glowing against the wet pavement, while people hurried beneath umbrellas, focused only on getting home before the weather grew worse. I blended into the evening crowd as naturally as I could, resisting the urge to glance over my shoulder every few seconds. Instead, I studied the reflections around me. Storefront windows, parked vehicles, glass bus shelters. Every polished surface became another chance to observe without announcing that I was looking. 7 blocks separated the coffee shop from my apartment. Usually the walk felt peaceful. That evening, every intersection seemed to last longer than it should. Every traffic light became another excuse for strangers to gather nearby. I reached the pharmacy on the corner and paused just long enough to pretend I was reading a display of seasonal allergy medicine. In the reflection of the front window, I noticed a man standing beneath the awning of a closed clothing store across the street. He held no shopping bags. He never checked his phone. He simply waited while looking in my general direction without making direct eye contact. When the pedestrian signal changed, I continued walking. 30 seconds later, his reflection moved too. My heartbeat quickened, but I forced my pace to remain steady. Panic changes the way people walk. Damien had made that much clear. I refused to advertise my fear. 2 blocks later, I stopped beside a bookstore and pretended to examine a table of discounted novels displayed near the entrance. A family walked past laughing together. A college student hurried by carrying a guitar case. Everything appeared ordinary until I caught another reflection in the bookstore window. The same man had crossed the street without hesitation. He now stood outside a convenience store, studying a newspaper he never actually unfolded. The distance between us remained almost exactly the same. Close enough to watch, far enough to disappear if confronted. A cold realization settled over me. This was no coincidence. I reached my apartment building just after 7 o'clock. The familiar smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery downstairs as Mrs. Callahan locked the front display case for the evening. She smiled warmly when she saw me. "Long day, Claire?" she asked. I smiled back, grateful that at least one part of my world still felt unchanged. Just ready for a quiet night. She wished me well before heading toward her car, completely unaware that I waited until she drove away before climbing the narrow staircase to my apartment. Inside, I locked the door twice, placed my purse on the kitchen counter, and turned off every light except the lamp beside my couch. The room settled into comfortable silence. Slowly, I stepped toward the window and pulled back the curtain no more than an inch. Across the street, a dark sedan sat beneath a maple tree with its headlights off. It had not been there when I arrived. The windshield reflected the streetlights too brightly for me to see inside, but one detail immediately caught my attention. The windshield wipers were still moving slowly across dry glass, as though the driver had only parked there seconds earlier. Then my phone vibrated again. Another message appeared on the screen before I could even lower the curtain. "You made it home right on time." My eyes remained fixed on the glowing screen long after the notification disappeared. "You made it home right on time." I read the sentence again, hoping repetition would somehow make it less unsettling. It never did. I slowly placed my phone face down on the kitchen counter and stepped away from the window. Every instinct told me to pull the curtains closed and pretend none of this was happening. But pretending had stopped working the moment Damien described my routine better than I could. The apartment felt unusually quiet that night. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock above the bookshelf, even the distant sound of traffic drifting through the rain all seemed amplified by the silence between them. I made myself a cup of tea out of habit, but it sat untouched beside the sink while I walked from room to room, checking each window, without standing directly in front of the glass. I could still see the dark sedan beneath the maple tree. It never moved. Around 10 o'clock, I finally forced myself to stop watching. I switched off the living room lamp and settled onto the couch with an old mystery novel, hoping familiar pages would slow my racing thoughts. I reached the third chapter before my phone vibrated again. This time it was not a message. It was an incoming call from an unknown number. The screen glowed in the darkness while the ringtone echoed through the apartment. I remembered Damien's advice almost word for word. If the call matters, they will leave a message. If it does not, they only want to know whether you will respond. I let it ring until the call ended on its own. Almost immediately, a voicemail notification appeared. My finger hovered over the screen for several seconds before I finally pressed play. There was no voice, no background noise, only several seconds of complete silence before the recording ended. Somehow that silence felt far louder than words ever could. I deleted the message without listening to it again. Morning arrived with clear skies and cool autumn sunlight spilling through the windows. When I looked outside, the dark sedan was gone. For the first time in days, I wondered whether the previous evening had marked the end instead of the beginning. Maybe whoever had been watching me had grown bored. Maybe Damien's confidence had discouraged them. Maybe I wanted to believe comforting explanations because they were easier than accepting uncertainty. Downstairs, Mrs. Callahan greeted me with her usual warm smile and handed me a fresh blueberry muffin before I could even reach my wallet. "Breakfast is on the house today," she said. "You look like you needed something cheerful." I thanked her and stepped onto the sidewalk, surprised by how normal the morning felt. Children waited for school buses. Cyclists hurried toward downtown. Delivery trucks unloaded fresh produce outside neighborhood markets. Life continued exactly as it always had. Halfway to the library, I reached the small public square where a fountain stood surrounded by wooden benches. As I crossed the brick walkway, something white caught my attention near the edge of the fountain. It was a small envelope resting neatly on the bench where I often sat during lunch breaks. My name was written across the front in clean block letters. Claire. No address. No stamp. No explanation. I looked carefully around the square before picking it up. Office workers passed by without slowing down. A jogger stretched beside the fountain. No one seemed interested in me. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. It showed me leaving the library 3 days earlier, carrying my canvas tote filled with donated books. The picture had been taken from across the street with remarkable clarity. On the back, written in black ink, was one simple sentence. "You never notice who leaves before you do." My heartbeat quickened as I lowered the photograph. Across the square, reflected in the glass doors of a nearby office building, I caught sight of a familiar figure wearing a charcoal suit. Damien stood on the opposite sidewalk, speaking quietly into his phone while looking not at me, but at someone standing several yards behind me. The photograph suddenly felt heavier than a single sheet of paper should. I forced myself not to turn around, even though every instinct demanded that I see who had been standing behind me only seconds earlier. Damien had never once asked me to trust my fear. He had always asked me to trust my patience. I slipped the photograph back into the envelope and continued walking toward the library at the same steady pace, pretending nothing had changed. In the reflection of a jewelry store window, I caught one last glimpse of Damien across the street. He ended his phone call, nodded almost imperceptibly towards someone beyond my view, and disappeared into the morning crowd without ever acknowledging me directly. The entire exchange lasted less than 5 seconds, yet it felt carefully planned. By the time I reached the library, my thoughts were moving faster than my footsteps. I unlocked the employee entrance, greeted Emily with my usual smile, and settled behind the circulation desk as though it were another ordinary workday. The familiar rhythm of checking out books and answering questions should have distracted me, but every sound seemed sharper than usual. Every customer who lingered near the entrance held my attention for a second longer than before. Around 11 o'clock, a man wearing a dark baseball cap stepped inside carrying a folded newspaper. He walked slowly through the history section before leaving without borrowing a single book. 10 minutes later, a woman entered asking for directions to the local courthouse. She thanked me politely and left after less than a minute. Nothing either of them did was suspicious by itself, yet I could not ignore the uncomfortable feeling that someone was measuring my reactions instead of my routine. Shortly before lunch, Emily leaned against the desk with 2 sandwiches from the cafe next door. "You have hardly looked away from the front door all morning," she said gently. "Did something happen?" I almost told her everything. The messages, the photographs, Damien, the strange certainty that invisible pieces were finally beginning to connect. Instead, I shook my head and accepted the sandwich with a grateful smile. "I think I just need a weekend away." She laughed softly. "Then promise me you will actually take one." Her kindness reminded me how much I wanted my ordinary life back. After lunch, I returned a stack of donated books to the reading room on the second floor. Large windows overlooked Maple Avenue, giving me a clear view of the sidewalk below. As I placed the final book on the shelf, a familiar charcoal sedan rolled quietly to the curb across the street. Damien remained inside for only a moment before another man approached the driver's window. They exchanged a few quiet words that I could not hear. No handshake, no dramatic gestures, just a brief conversation before the other man walked away carrying a small envelope. Damien drove off in the opposite direction without attracting a single curious glance from anyone nearby. It struck me then that his greatest strength was not commanding attention. It was avoiding it. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated inside my pocket. This time the message came from an unfamiliar number I had never seen before. There were only 8 words. "Leave through the west entrance after 5 today." I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening once again. Unlike the earlier messages, this one did not try to frighten me. It sounded almost instructional. Before I could decide whether to ignore it, another notification appeared. This message contained no words at all, only a photograph taken moments earlier from somewhere outside the library. It showed the second-floor reading room window where I had been standing less than a minute before. The angle was distant, but clear enough that there could be no mistake. Someone had known exactly where I was while I had been watching the street below, and for the first time, I realized the person observing me had been expecting me to look outward while they quietly watched from somewhere I had never even considered. The photograph stayed on my phone screen for the rest of the afternoon like a question I could not answer. Someone had been close enough to capture the second-floor reading room only moments after I walked away from the window. They were not guessing anymore. They were anticipating every move before I made it. I slipped the phone into my pocket and forced myself back into the familiar rhythm of shelving books, checking out novels, and helping students locate research materials. If anyone watched me through another camera, I wanted them to see nothing except an ordinary librarian finishing an ordinary workday. Every smile felt rehearsed. Every calm breath required effort. At exactly 5 o'clock, the library announcement signaled closing time. Emily gathered her things and waved goodbye as she headed toward the employee parking lot. "See you Monday, Claire. Have a good weekend," I answered, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I waited another minute before reaching into my pocket and looking once more at the message. "Leave through the west entrance after 5 today." I should have ignored it. Every sensible part of me knew that. Instead, curiosity mixed with fear in a way that made standing still impossible. The west entrance was rarely used except by delivery drivers. It opened onto a narrow service street lined with brick buildings and a small public parking area. As I pushed open the heavy metal door, cool autumn air met my face. The alley was almost empty. A delivery truck pulled away from the loading dock at the far end, while dry leaves rolled quietly across the pavement. I took 3 cautious steps outside before noticing a black sedan parked beneath an old oak tree. The engine was running, but the headlights remained off. The passenger window lowered halfway. Damien sat behind the wheel wearing the same charcoal suit, looking as composed as though we had arranged this meeting days ago. "Get in," he said. I hesitated. "How did you know I would actually come?" A faint smile appeared. "Because whoever sent that message believed you would." I looked around the nearly empty street. "Was that message from you?" "No." His answer came instantly. "But I hoped you would receive it." Confusion washed over me. "You hoped someone would keep following me?" Damien glanced toward the side mirror before looking back at me. "I hoped they would become confident." I climbed into the passenger seat and closed the door. The interior smelled faintly of cedar and fresh leather. Nothing inside the car looked extravagant. It was clean, quiet, almost understated. Damien eased away from the curb without rushing, merging naturally into the evening traffic. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, I broke the silence. "Who are you really?" He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Someone who learned a long time ago that patterns reveal intentions." "That is not an answer." "No," he admitted calmly. "It is the only answer I can give today." We drove through downtown without any obvious destination. As we stopped at a red light, Damien adjusted the rearview mirror by less than an inch. I noticed his eyes settle on the reflection rather than the traffic behind us. "Do not turn around," he said quietly. "A silver sport utility vehicle has followed us through the last 4 intersections." My pulse immediately quickened. "Are you certain?" "Certain enough to test it." The light turned green. Instead of continuing straight, Damien made an unexpected right turn onto a quiet residential street lined with white colonial homes. 2 blocks later, he circled a neighborhood park before returning to the main avenue from the opposite direction. I watched his hands remain perfectly relaxed on the steering wheel. When we stopped beside another traffic signal, he nodded almost imperceptibly toward the mirror. Still there. Against every instinct, I kept my eyes forward. Then Damien reached into the center console, removed a folded photograph, and placed it gently in my lap. It showed the same silver sport utility vehicle parked across the street from my apartment 3 mornings earlier, and written across the bottom in neat handwriting were 6 words that made every piece finally begin to fit together. They stopped watching when I started watching them. My fingers tightened around the photograph as the evening traffic drifted quietly around us. They stopped watching when I started watching them. I read the sentence twice before lifting my eyes toward Damien. For the first time since we met, I realized he had never tried to frighten me. He had been preparing me to notice what fear usually hides. "Who wrote this?" I asked softly. Damien kept both hands on the steering wheel. "Someone who wanted to remind themselves that patience has limits." "Is this from the people following me?" He shook his head once. "No. It came from someone who spent weeks following them instead." I stared at him without speaking. Every answer he gave uncovered another layer instead of solving the mystery. We drove another mile before he turned into a quiet riverside park where families usually gathered on warm weekends. At this hour, only a few people remained. A father pushed his young daughter on a swing, while an elderly couple walked slowly along the river path. The peaceful setting felt strangely comforting after the tension of the past several days. Damien parked beneath a row of maple trees, but left the engine running. He looked through the windshield instead of at me. "Tell me something honestly, Claire. Before last week, did you ever believe your life mattered to someone you had never met?" I laughed quietly, more from disbelief than humor. "I worked in a library. I lived above a bakery. My biggest concern was returning books to the correct shelf. No, I never imagined any of this." He nodded as though that answer confirmed something important. "Exactly." I looked down at the photograph again. "Then why me?" Damien finally turned toward me. His expression remained calm, but there was something heavier behind his eyes than I had noticed before. "Because whoever has been studying you made one mistake." "What mistake?" "They assumed an ordinary life means an unimportant one." His words settled over me more deeply than I expected. For days I had believed I was reacting to someone else's decisions. Now, for the first time, I wondered whether my ordinary routines had become valuable precisely because they were honest, predictable, and untouched by whatever hidden world Damien belonged to. A black sedan rolled quietly past the park entrance before continuing down the road without slowing. Damien watched it disappear through the rearview mirror. "They are leaving," I whispered. "No," he replied. "They are changing positions." I felt my heartbeat quicken again. "How can you always tell?" A faint smile crossed his face. "Because people who are confident stop looking directly at what interests them. They learn to look past it." I thought back to the coffee shop, the bookstore window, the anonymous messages, the silent voicemail, the photograph waiting on the park bench, and the silver sport utility vehicle that had followed us across town. Every moment had shared one thing in common. Someone had wanted me to feel observed without ever introducing themselves. Damien reached into his jacket and removed a small cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. He handed it to me without explanation. My name was written across the front in elegant handwriting. "What is this?" I asked. "Open it after I leave you at home." "Why not now?" "Because once you read it, your understanding of the last 7 days will change." I studied the envelope, feeling its surprising weight in my hands. "Did you write it?" Damien looked out toward the quiet river before answering. "No." His voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "Someone wrote it years ago, long before either of us knew this week would ever happen." 20 minutes later, he stopped outside my apartment building exactly where he had picked me up. Before I stepped out of the car, I looked back at him one final time. "Will I see you tomorrow?" He held my gaze for a brief moment before answering with complete certainty. "That depends on what you find inside the envelope. Because if it says what I believe it says, then none of this ever began with someone following you. It began with someone searching for you." The apartment felt impossibly still after Damien drove away. I stood at the window until the charcoal sedan disappeared beyond the corner, then looked down at the cream-colored envelope resting quietly in my hands. It was remarkable how something so small could outweigh every unanswered question from the past week. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat at my kitchen table beneath the warm yellow light that had always made the room feel safe. Tonight, it simply made everything feel honest. I broke the blue wax seal carefully, unfolded the single sheet inside, and immediately recognized that the handwriting was older than the neat block letters from the anonymous messages. It was steady, elegant, and deeply personal. "Claire, if this letter has reached you, then someone finally realized what should have remained forgotten. None of what happened this week is your fault. You were never chosen because of who you are today. You were protected because of something your mother did years ago." I stopped breathing for a moment. My mother had passed away when I was 16. She had spent most of her life working as a nurse at a community hospital outside Boston. She never spoke about danger. She never mentioned hidden enemies or extraordinary secrets. To me, she had simply been the kindest person I had ever known. My eyes continued across the page. More than 20 years ago, she helped a frightened stranger without asking who he was or why he needed help. She believed compassion should never require permission. That stranger survived because she refused to walk away. Before leaving, he made one promise. If her family ever needed protection, it would come before they even knew they needed it. My hands trembled slightly as I lowered the letter. Suddenly, every impossible piece found its place. The photographs, the quiet surveillance, Damien's patience. None of it had begun because I was important. It had begun because someone else had never forgotten an act of kindness that the rest of the world considered ordinary. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. My heartbeat quickened, but this time I did not panic. I looked through the peephole. Mrs. Callahan stood outside, holding a fresh loaf of bread wrapped in brown paper. I opened the door with a relieved smile. "I baked too much tonight," she said warmly. "I thought you might like some." I thanked her, accepting the bread with genuine gratitude. As she walked back downstairs, I realized something had changed inside me. For days I had been searching every reflection for danger. Now I found myself noticing kindness instead. I stepped onto the small balcony outside my apartment. Across the street, the maple tree swayed gently beneath the evening breeze. There was no dark sedan waiting beneath its branches. No unfamiliar figure pretending to read a newspaper. The street looked exactly the way it had before my world changed. My phone vibrated one final time. It was a message from an unknown number, but unlike every message before it, there was no mystery waiting inside. "Thank you for trusting the truth before you could see all of it. Stay exactly who you are." The number became inactive before I could respond. I never heard from it again. Several weeks passed. Life slowly returned to familiar rhythms. I reopened the library every weekday morning before 9. I still stopped for coffee on Thursdays. I still bought fresh bread downstairs on Saturday mornings. The difference was no longer my routine. It was the way I carried it. I no longer counted every 7 steps. I no longer searched every reflection with fear. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, I would notice a charcoal sedan passing slowly down Maple Avenue before disappearing into traffic without stopping. I never knew whether Damien was inside, and somehow I no longer needed to know. Some promises are not meant to be announced. They are simply kept. I used to believe that powerful people changed the world through influence, wealth, or control. Now I understand something very different. Sometimes the strongest promise begins with a nurse who refuses to ignore a stranger, survives for decades without asking for recognition, and quietly reaches the daughter who never knew she had been protected all along. That was the week I stopped looking behind me in fear, because I finally understood that the greatest protection I had ever received was never built on power. It was built on remembered kindness.